Hello and welcome back to Under One Roof, the podcast where we discuss important housing issues. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Simcock. Today we're bringing you the final episode of our special three-part series, Making Our House a Home, Rental Reform Across the UK, part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science. In our previous episodes, we talked about the meaning of home with Professor Kim McKee and heard the tenant's perspective from Dan Wilson-Craw of Generation Rent. In this episode, we'll hear from the landlord's perspective. I'm pleased to be joined by John Blackwood, Chief Executive of the Scottish Association of Landlords. We'll discuss how the upcoming rental reforms are affecting landlords across the UK, the challenges and opportunities these changes bring, and the important role landlords have in helping tenants make a house a home. Whether you're a tenant, landlord, policymaker, or just interested in how the UK's rental market is changing, this conversation will offer you valuable insights on how we can work together to create homes where everyone feels secure and respected. So let's jump into our conversation with John Blackwood. Hello and welcome back to the Under One Roof podcast. I'm joined now with John Blackwood from the Scottish Association of Landlords. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today, John. So could you just start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about the Scottish Association of Landlords as well?
Yeah, of course. First of all, nice to speak to you, Tom, and thank you very much for inviting us onto your podcast. The Scottish Association of Landlords is very much what it says in the tin. It's an organisation there to support landlords and letting agents throughout Scotland. We're the largest organisation for landlords and letting agents in Scotland. Our job is very much being the voice of the private rented sector for those private housing providers there. We're trying to ultimately empower the sector so that we can have a well-functioning private rented sector. It's very important for us to have a sector that works for landlords and letting agents, but for tenants who are consumers as well. So we need to have a well-functioning sector to not only survive, but to thrive over the next few years. And that's very much within our consciousness. Our ultimate aim is that we want a good home for everyone in the private rented sector. And we believe the private rented sector in many cases does already do that. But we're all aware that all sectors can improve, and the private rented sector is no different. So we're very keen, I guess, to really change the face of not only what does the private rented sector do and how useful is it in society, but actually about the image it portrays as well too. So there's a huge piece of work ahead of us in really turning that around so that we can see that private landlords are an essential part of the housing mix. And that's here in Scotland, but equally in the rest of the UK as well.
And I think it's really interesting that you sort of said that about changing the image of private landlords. And it is struck me back to conversations having at a conference in Europe over the summer. And there's discussions how in some countries they don't have the term landlord at all. And it can be quite more positive in how that's perceived. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were around actual term.
Exactly. Literally, these are the conversations we're having, and we have been for some time. Well, we published our strategy at the beginning of this year, and it's there on our website, scottishlandlords.com, top right-hand corner. You can click on that and all the pages associated with it. And yeah, it has come up in our discussions with members and stakeholders. Does it really represent what the modern private housing provider is and what they do? I think the big question is, what other word do you use? And we've not come up with a solution to that one yet. Or I think there's two schools of thought. We either think of another word. If you think of social housing providers, housing associations, they're landlords just the same, but they don't tend to refer to themselves as landlords, as social housing providers. So are we private housing providers? Of course we are, but is that the term we should be using? Or do we just actually embrace, do you know what, we are landlords, that people associate with that positively and negatively, but maybe should we be taking on board to change that image and say, do you know what, this is the new model landlord. and almost like what political parties have done in the past to reinvent themselves. So do we need to do something similar? I don't know. So all answers on a postcard, really. So really delighted to hear any views on that. But the important thing is, yes, we need to change that image in a more positive way.
And so coming on to one of my first questions is around, what are your thoughts on the proposed rental reforms in Scotland and more broadly across the UK, specifically about how they might impact landlords?
I think the biggest concern, I think you have to always remember that landlords are investors. And investors, by their very nature, are nervous about changes, whether that's in legislation, the markets, consumer confidence, whatever, and actually I always argue that property investors are perhaps the most nervous of all types of investors, simply because these investors have invested in property. So why do they do that? Because they think it's a safer bet, it's a long-term bet, and regardless of what happens in the world markets, property tends to be a safe enough investment, for want of a better expression. And that's generally the case. So there is that reluctance to embrace an appetite that potentially could damage that investment. And I think that goes without saying. Most of us, even non-landlords, probably would embrace that and would accept that. So anything that looks at change in the sense of legislation imposed by government or the rhetoric that we hear from politicians actually makes the sector a bit nervous. It makes them think, hang on a second, maybe this isn't the business to be in anymore. I think fundamentally we have to always remember landlords are business people, they are investors. Whether you've got one property you're renting out or 20, it makes no difference. Ultimately, you're looking for a capital return on your property. Let's face it, landlords are in it for the business making a return. Might not be on a month-on-month basis through rental income. Lots of landlords don't make money, contrary to public opinion, on a regular basis through rental income. But they're thinking it's worth that investment because in 10, 20 years' time, I'll sell that. And it's at that point that I'll realise that asset and realise the investment. Any potential change that's going to come into the sector makes landlords nervous. And for some people, it can just be too much. They just decide, you know what, I'm going to put my money somewhere else, or I'm going to invest it elsewhere or use it for another purpose. And you have to remember, lots of landlords, and actually increasingly so, are aging. So they're maybe in their 60s or the 70s, and, older people generally, and I'm getting there myself, don't like change. So you impose change, whether it's legislation changes or whatever, and they start to think, well, maybe now's the time to get out. And that's what we're seeing here in Scotland. When tenants give notice and they leave, that's an opportunity for a landlord to think about their future strategy. Is this a time to sell? And for many, they're saying, yes, it is. And now you might think, well, there's nothing wrong with that because, of course, the property never vanishes. Somebody's going to live in it. The issue is we're seeing those properties lost to the private rented sector. When we're analysing and speaking to our members and saying, well, what's happening with the property, it's homeowners that are buying them, which is great news for homeowners, especially young people wanting to be homeowners. But what about renters? So we're really seeing the pool of properties available to renters decreasing. And rent control is one of the reasons, or the fear of rent control is one of the reasons for that, but not the only one. So it's a multi-factored issue and something that we need to take on board and address with the sector.
Yeah. And what do you think possibly about the fear of change? Is it potentially then not an education, but communication sort of thing about what the benefits of maybe some of this legislation could be for landlords?
Oh, indeed. That's the same for everything. And you'll know as an organisation like SAL, over the last 23 years, we very much focused on embracing new ways of working and saying to landlords, yes, we need to improve the quality of the the properties we are providing and the homes that we're offering. But equally at the same time, we need to improve standards. But we also need to encourage new investment in the sector as well too. So how do you do all of that to encourage investment without finding people off at the same time? That's a difficult balance to get right. And certainly any landlord who joins an organisation like us, fundamentally, they want to learn to do a better job. So education is probably something that they would sign up to, or how do I access the information and the help that I need? Well, our organisation does it. Obviously, there's many landlords who are not members of landlords organisations, and they're probably the ones that we need to be tackling more. But just starting with their own membership, yes, education is always an issue. Reassuring them that actually there could be positive change in legislation. And as you know, when bills are presented to Parliament or civil servants are looking at policy papers and documents, that's only the beginning of the conversation. So often what comes out at the end is something which is much more balanced. Not always, but that's always the hope. And that's what organisations like the Scottish Association of Landlords tries to achieve at the end of the day. I think fundamentally, landlords as business people, if you're in business, and many landlords are in business, or maybe their primary job is doing something else, not being a landlord. So they're aware of how factors change their business and how you have to adapt businesses over the years. And being a landlord actually is no different. The trouble is when you are faced with a situation like rent control, which actually means that potentially rents are going to go up. That's what rent control means. That's what it does. Wherever it operates throughout the world, rents still go up. And that's what we're starting to see in Scotland. We've had landlords who've rented properties for many years and maybe had a tenant in there for a considerable number of years. So we're hearing many members now saying, I've got a good tenant, we've got a really good relationship. I've invested in that for some years now. I don't want that to change, but the rent is way below the market. And, I understand that, and that's their fault for not increasing it. But why increase the rent with a tenant when potentially the reason why they don't do it is because they're frightened the tenant might leave? But now they're in the position where they're saying, well, I'm going to have to raise it in order to keep up with the legislation of rent control and what that might well mean if they come to re-let the property. So ironically, rent control raises rents, and I don't think that's a good thing for tenants, albeit it might be in a controlled manner. So you're not going to have huge rent hikes, which I know does happen in the sector. Of course it does.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. You said about that rent control and that sort of stabilisation. It reminds me back to sort of the pre-Section 21 sort of consultations on longer-term tenancies in England. And I remember a briefing that we did for the RLA, and that was like, actually landlords are sort of okay with sort of rent stabilisation if it was CPI or, some sort of annual sort of a rental increase. But then the thinking was actually, does it encourage landlords to be increasing the rents every year?
There's no question about it. So we're hearing from landlords now saying every 12 months I raise my rent. I remember when I was speaking to the minister when the initial rent controls potentially they've never been used in Scotland, the rent pressure zones. But when they were presented in the bill at the time before the Scottish Parliament, and Minister said to me, I've got some good news and bad news for you. This is what we've decided as a government. And she said, we're going to limit how often the landlord can raise the rent. And that's going to be no more than once every 12 months from the last time that you raised it. And I turned round to her and I said, well, thanks for the pay rise. And I said, because I don't raise my rents every 12 months and many landlords don't. And she said, oh, well, you don't need to worry about it then. That wouldn't be a problem. But it's not like that. If you put that in legislation, it will become the norm that rents go up every 12 months. And that was introduced, as you know, in 2017 in Scotland, in the new private residential tenancy. We have seen year on year, the practice has changed where landlords are increasing their rents. on a 12-month basis. So what has it done? It has increased rents, right? There's no question about it. Now, the backdrop to all of that is, of course, costs have increased. And that's, I think, the main driver for landlords looking at increasing rents because, of course, with a cost of living crisis, which affects landlords as well as tenants. And that's a big message we've been trying to get across because, of course, tradespeople's costs have gone up. The cost of compliance has gone up. And the cost of regulation with the Scottish Government and local authorities has gone up. So a lot of landlords are saying that compounded with, if they have borrowing in the property, their mortgages have gone up too. So they're saying the costs on a month-on-month basis are an extra £300-400 that they didn't have before. So they're saying that now, even with rents going up on a 12-month basis, there's still not enough rent coming in to cover the costs. So lots of those landlords are saying that those properties are now unaffordable to let out. That's the issue. Of course, this is against the backdrop of, for many tenants, rents being unaffordable, but the rental income equally for many landlords is not enough to sustain that let property. And from research we did almost a year ago with our members, we're just about to do it again, 1 in 10 respondents said that they had a property which was no longer financially viable. That's another reason why some people are getting out of the sector.
How do you believe the rental reforms can strike a balance both between protecting tenants' rights and ensuring landlords can effectively manage their properties?
Well, I think it's like every business, as long as you know what's going to be happening in the future and rent control, you and I know that there's different forms of rent control that could be imposed. One which I think is more palatable, if that's the right word, to the sector, is the one where it's looking at rent stabilisation. So it's about avoiding these peaks and troughs that sometimes the market can provide. What we say, of course, is the reason why costs go up and rental costs and costs of renting go up is because of the lack of supply and there's more demand. We're seeing more tenants asking to rent properties than ever. I was at a conference yesterday and they were saying in England and Wales, on average, maybe there's about 16 people chasing every property that's for let. In Scotland, that's 30, 40. I would say that's double that anyway. And thankfully, it's starting to slow down, which is good news. But I don't think that's good for a landlord any more than that's good for a tenant, because you just can't meet that demand. And so that's telling you customers want the service you're providing. They want a home to live in. And if we provide more, then that in itself, through basic economics, is going to reduce the cost. And we've seen that. Certainly here in Edinburgh, we saw that about 15 years ago. There was a huge investment in new build properties of 2-bedroom properties. And the price of 2 bedrooms really, really lowered. So you used to be able to get £1,000 in those days. And I remember within a couple of months, that rent went down to 750, simply because there was not quite an over-provision of 2-bedroom properties, but there was a greater amount of choice for tenants. And that meant that the market had to adjust accordingly. So we know it can happen even in pressured markets. So how can we actually think about creating a system that still allows landlords to get an income that's going to at least cover their costs, but they're looking for profit in the long term. You have to remember that too. But let's start with at least covering the costs. And that can be done even with some form of rent stabilisation in the long term, as long as it's realistic. And you'll be aware in Scotland, the Housing Minister recently announced, thanks to our and others lobbying, to say that actually there needs to be a realistic level here that we can work with. And they've suggested CPI plus 1%. Now, that's against the backdrop of the bill saying potentially it could be set at 0%. Now, it's even in a pressured market, it's completely unrealistic to think that all other costs can go up, but the rent's not allowed to go up. So that's unsustainable for anybody providing that accommodation. So that just wouldn't work in the marketplace. So thankfully that rent will go up, albeit in a controlled manner. the issue now is between tenancies. Not every landlord's charging the same rent. As I mentioned earlier, you have landlords who have long-term tenants and their rent will be way below the market. And would you address that? Well, largely when that tenant moves out, it's empty. You then invest in the property, which everybody needs to do to a degree, and you put it in the market at a higher rent. You would put it at the market rent. It's at that point you would readjust the rent. And I think that's the right thing to do rather than doing it with sitting tenants. If that works for you and if it works for the tenant. So the problem is that those landlords perversely are penalised for not increasing the rent year on year for a number of years. And they're going to be in a position saying, well, actually, I'm not able to offer this to the market at a market rent. That just wouldn't be possible under the existing proposals that we have before the Parliament. So lots of those landlords will just say, well, I'm just going to exit the sector here. And that's what they'll do at that time. And ironically, if they sell to another landlord, then that landlord could let it at a higher rate. So where's the logic behind that? So I think we need to have another discussion around that. What happens between tenancies? How can we make that work for everybody? My concern is if landlords can't raise their rents between tenancies, they will be able to raise it potentially to the CPI plus 1%. But if you've got really low rent, that's just not going to cut the mustard. We want landlords to be investing in the property at that time. But those landlords will say, well, where's the money going to come from? It's not there in the rent, so I won't invest, which means over a period of time, the quality of that accommodation will deteriorate. And that's us going back to where we were 10, 15 years ago. And I don't want to go there.
Yeah. And you can sort of see, I think, similar concerns, even in the higher education market around university tuition fees, especially in England.
Yeah.
Maybe
exactly.
not in Scotland, around the freezes and how that affects the university finances. So I think you can see those playing out in other sectors as well, where there's those similar sort of things going on. But thinking about the legislation as well, there's a few other elements around the right to sort of freedoms to personalise rented homes with permission, and sort of the potential to allow tenants to have pets as well. What do you think, from the landlord's perspective, are some of those maybe benefits and challenges of those two additions to the legislation?
Well, I think where we are on that point and with the discussions that we're having is it's very difficult to develop a position on it without more detail from the government. What is that legislation going to look like? All we have at the moment is a high-level thought in the bill. And primary legislation, as you know, is just a bare bones of legislation saying we are going to allow tenants to have this right, which will not be unreasonably withheld. But what does that mean? So what does that look like? Are you talking about putting a picture up on the wall, or redesigning that wall, putting a new construction on it, which could effectively damage it, like, shelving or whatever? I don't know. So we need to go into the detail, and the government's keen to produce that in time. And through regulation, we'll see that, and they'll say, well, this would be perfectly acceptable for a landlord, or should be expected of the landlord to say yes. But actually, if you do Y, then the landlord perhaps more reasonably could say no to that. So all of these discussions we need to have. So it's very difficult for us to take a position on whether that's okay or not without the detail. And I'm sure tenants will be in the same position. They'll know, okay, you're saying this, but what does that actually mean? As I say, the high level thought is tenants will have greater rights to personalise and have pets, which will not be unreasonably withheld from the landlord. So what does unreasonably withheld look like? So what is reasonable and what isn't? And where do you draw that line? And really, when we're trying to pin the government down on that at the moment, what they're saying is, well, actually, it's going to be no different to what it's like at the moment. And where they think the position is that lots of tenants are just frightened to have that conversation with the landlord, to say, can I put up a picture, or can I have a pet, for fear of the landlord bringing the tenancy to an end. So what they're trying to do is empower the tenants to be able to say, well, I would like this, and I think this is reasonable to have this. So the onus is then on the landlord to say, well, actually, on consideration, I agree or I don't agree. And these are the reasons. Now, in reality, lots of us as landlords will say we have these conversations anyway with our tenants. And, sometimes we come to the conclusion, yes, we agree with them, sometimes we don't. But there is an open dialogue there. And I do get the point that for many tenants, they don't feel to have that dialogue with the landlord. And the legislation would empower them to do so. For us, I think largely within the sector, we're already doing that. So certainly for me personally, I have tenants with pets. I think it's important. I'm a pet lover myself, and I've been a private rented tenant twice in my housing career. And certainly the second time, I had 2 cats. It was important to us. They're part of our family. I needed to find a home that the landlord would be okay with that. And now, if that meant I needed to give greater security to reassure that landlord that they wouldn't wreck the place, then I don't think that's unreasonable. Because at the end of the day, the onus is on me to take responsibility for my pets. And I'm perfectly happy with that. So, and I could give evidence of that to the landlord if they were. So it's about having that conversation. And I think, yes, I think everybody should be empowered to have that conversation. But at what point would you draw the line to say yes or no to that request from the tenant? And we've yet to see that. So it will be another year or so before we get that consultation on the regulations.
And I think it's really important, like you said, about empowering the tenants to have those conversations. And I think that's maybe one of those key things. And I think I'm thinking more broadly, it's in the England context where, with Section 21, where it is that fear of that conversation and the outcome, in the English context at least. And I think it was quite positive you're saying about empowering renters to have that conversation with the landlords.
Yeah, and equally as with the landlords being empowered. When I started off in my housing career, I was supporting homeless people and working with tenants who really felt that they had no rights and they had nowhere to find a home to start with. And it was about encouraging the private renter sector and other housing providers to give them that opportunity to make a home and have a roof over their heads. And I very quickly found that they just felt they had no power whatsoever, and somehow we needed to empower them. We needed to support them. When I then went to work with private landlords and became one myself, I realised that equally they were saying, we have no power in this relationship. So it's the tenant who has all the power. Now, in reality, overnight I was thinking, well, actually, both of you are saying that. So both of you can be right. Tenants and landlords equally can't not have power. That can't be the case. But that's your perception and that's how you see it, because you only see it from your perspective. And landlords still to this day, even though legislation has changed, and yes, arguably tenants are more empowered now through legislation than before, they have more rights. So I have no problem with tenants having more rights. But landlords need rights too. And they need to feel they can exercise those rights if need be. So when it came to ending fixed-term tenancies, which we had with the introduction of the new private residential tenancy in 2017, as a landlord, I was saying, actually, we want tenants to stay a long time in our properties. We're not in the business of getting rid of tenants. That's not our primary aim. In fact, most tenancies, wherever you are, come to an end by the tenant giving notice, not by the landlord giving notice. However, landlords need to feel they've got security, that if something goes wrong, they can get the property back, so they can issue notice. So the issue is not about fixed-term tenancies. There is a difference though in saying that with regards to student accommodation, and I think there's a whole other issue around that there. It's a different marketplace. But generally, we need legislation that allows somebody to feel they can move into the private rented sector and make a home within that property. But equally, that the landlord still feels that they have security to regain that possession when things go wrong. Do they have that security is the big question. And how can we make sure that that's the case for the future? So for a well-functioning private renting sector to work, both parties, customers and a service provider in any industry, needs to feel that they have the appropriate rights to function effectively. And that's what we want. No landlord wants a rent to be unaffordable to a tenant. That is not in a landlord's interest. Because why? At some point, tenant wouldn't be able to afford to pay it. Your relationship with the tenant will break down and you probably will end up having to evict them through rent arrears. That's not a good situation for a landlord any more than it is for a tenant. So we need to find a solution that, as I say, suits everyone. And can that be achieved? Of course, everything can be achieved. But there has to be an open dialogue, I think, between landlords and tenants and government to find that space that we can operate in, rather than the space that we're in at the moment, where it's very much, as we see it, landlords bad, tenants good. But that's not a good space to be in.
Yeah. So a more safe space for discussion in terms of the future of the private rented sector.
Exactly. And, what's that going to look like? We're saying to ministers and civil servants, just tell us what you think the private rented sector should be. We hear a lot about, and even from the UK government, ministers saying, are landlords working people or not? And I don't want to necessarily get into that discussion just now, but that's offensive to people to hear that and saying, well, do you want us or not to operate in that sector? And actually, we're business people. We're investors, as I mentioned earlier. If you don't want us, just tell us to go. Just be honest. When you have that conversation, oh, no, we don't. You're a valuable part of the housing mix. We need you to be investing. We want you to be in the sector. So, well, it doesn't sound like that. So how can we get that message across? And so you either want us or not. And what do you want the private rented sector to look like? Who do you want to be operating within it as private housing providers? Is that institutions or is that private individuals? Tell us. And equally, who do you want to be living in the sector? I think, we have these arguments a lot, but I think sometimes we miss the point that really the issue is we've not got enough affordable social housing in this country. And that's through successive governments not investing in enough social housing. That's the crux of it. And that actually, if we dealt with that, I don't think we'll ever have enough to what we need. I think we've missed that boat. But that doesn't stop us building more and creating more. So let's focus on that, and that will take pressure off the sector.
Definitely. I think that's a core policy aspect.
Everybody in the sector, private sector, social sector, public policy, everybody's saying we need more social homes and that. And I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And I think then if you then look at the debates about the welfare system and local housing allowance and, the debates on how that's been spent in terms of the private rented sector, if there was being spent on the social housing sector, that could then reduce demand. And as you said, maybe fix some of those issues of affordability and supply.
You're talking about local housing allowance, think of what's been spent in temporary accommodation, which is still incredibly expensive. So could you not address that through increasing local housing allowance, even though that's going to private landlords? Don't see that as a problem because it's still cheaper to the public purse to do that, but allow those people to live in the private rented sector rather than bed and breakfast accommodation, for instance, or whoever the provider of the temporary accommodation actually is. So, we need something that works for the public purse as well.
What role do landlords play in building sort of stable and thriving communities? And how do you think these rental reforms might influence that?
I think landlords have got a very important part to play as part of the housing mix. I think we need to be recognised for doing that. I don't think there's enough recognition of that. I think landlords are seen sometimes as the problem within the housing sector rather than actually the solution. And how can we work with that solution to try and help the overall sector? So I think there needs to be an attitudinal change to the role of the private landlord for essential service they're actually providing within the local communities. So I think we need to tackle that first and say there is a role for private investment. There is a role for private landlord. And if there isn't, then just come out and tell us that. Let's have that discussion. Let's come to that conclusion. And these landlords can then make an informed decision about future investments based on that. But let's look at that and say, is there seriously a role for private individuals? And if there is, which there seems to be and historically has been, then say, okay, right, so how can we make that work? Where we can create a well-functioning overall housing sector where you play a role in that. So you've got responsibilities as that landlord, but equally, you need to be empowered. You have the rights to be able to access your property and make sure that it's an investment that you feel is secure enough for you to continue with. So they're big conversations, but I think we need to start from that point of view. So of course, I'm going to say landlords have a place to play. I think anybody investing in homes for people to live in, of course, you have an important role to play. The issue is how much of a role. And then focus on the other aspects of the housing sector. Those who want to become homeowners, how can we enable them to do that? And I think there's other fixes we could be looking at. You know, we'll always have landlords wanting to exit the sector. That's part of the nature of the sector. But who are they selling to? We need to be thinking about that. So could we facilitate something where when they come to the end of their landlord career, shall we say, and they want to sell that property for whatever reason, who do they sell to? How can we facilitate that? Could that, if it was ex-local authority stock, could it go back to the council? So how can we join those dots together, make that accessible for the landlord and the council? We've been saying that for some time now and talking to government about it, that, you know, our members are saying, I want to get rid of the property. It's the right time for me. I would like to sell it to the council, but the council aren't interested. That's just crazy. Or they've got a tenant in the property and they want to sell it with the tenant in it because they've got a good tenant and they don't want to give notice to the tenant, but they just don't want to be a landlord anymore for whatever reason. And they go to the council and they say, well, would you like to buy it? And the council says, you would need to evict the tenant first because we only want empty properties. We don't want properties with tenants in it. That's unacceptable. So thankfully now we're making some inroads with that, and Scottish Government has funded local authorities to buy properties that could even have tenants in them if they're in the areas that they want them to be, given the circumstances of the tenancy. So that would be one way of shifting the ownership of that property. Or if the tenant wants to buy, maybe they need a deposit to be able to. So how can we help that tenant? So there's clever, I don't think it is that clever. I think we just need to sit down and say, right, how can we sometimes shift the ownership of these properties when the time arises without hassle and potentially a property lying empty for a long period of time? Yeah. I suppose that's a really interesting point to leave this interview on, because I think that thought about shifting tenures quite easily for the property is something definitely to think about going forward in the future. So I'd just like to say thank you again, John, for taking your time to speak to me on this podcast. And I'm sure our listeners are really interested in what you've had to say about the private rent sector and that positive vision in terms of a sector that works for both landlords and tenants. But I just wanted to provide you with an option if there's anything else you'd like to add about the importance of balancing the needs of landlords and tenants in the evolving rented sector. I think just to reiterate, what we want is ultimately in our sector to be able to provide the best homes possible, and we want a well-functioning sector which is properly invested in, where landlords feel empowered and that they've given the rights that they need, but equally the tenants feel secure to be able to live in the properties and call it home. If we can achieve that, which doesn't seem unrealistic, then we can see positive relationships and long-term relationships between landlords and tenants. We do know in the whole that actually it works well. Most tenants in the private rented sector are happy with their landlords and the service and the homes that's provided. Of course, some wouldn't be, and we need to address that. But let's be positive about looking at how the sector does work well for many people. Why does it work well? Because the relationships have been built between landlords and tenants, relationships of trust. You know, as a landlord and many landlords with small portfolios, they'll tell, we know our tenants very, very well. We can lift the phone to each other. We can have discussions. That's the kind of relationships we want to foster. Rather than it being good practice, we want that to be the norm in the sector and the expectation of every tenant and every landlord going forward.
Thank you very much, John.
Lovely to talk to you.
That wraps up our conversation with John Blackwood. A big thank you to John for sharing the landlord's point of view on rental reforms and emphasising the importance of cooperation between landlords and tenants. We hope this episode has helped you understand how rental reforms are affecting everyone involved in housing. This concludes our special series, Making a House a Home, Rental Reform Across the UK, part of the ESRC Festival of Social Science. We hope these conversations have shed light on housing issues and how we can all work together for positive change. If you've enjoyed this series, please subscribe to Under One Roof, leave us a review and share these episodes with others who might find them interesting. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Dr. Tom Simcock, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Under One Roof in the future.